On June 16, 1976, children walked out of class carrying schoolbooks and placards, but by night, South Africa was counting the dead. Stay with this docket because the real question is not only why they marched, but why the state was already waiting. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Like, share, and help keep this evidence from being buried. Silent Docket Africa. The children who walked into history. The June 16, 1976 Soweto Uprising. On the morning of June 16, 1976, children left their classrooms in Soweto. They were not carrying weapons. They were not marching for fame. They were carrying schoolbags, exercise books, handwritten placards, and a question the state had refused to hear. Why should a child be forced to learn in the language of the system that was already breaking him? That morning, the streets of Soweto did not yet know what they were about to become. They were ordinary streets. Dust, winter light, school shoes on tar, girls in uniform, boys in jerseys. A crowd forming one body, one rhythm, one refusal. The protest was about Afrikaans. At least, that was the official explanation. But Afrikaans was only the surface. Beneath it was something older. Bantu Education. A system designed not to open the mind but to contain it. A system that did not ask what black children could become. It had already decided. They were to become workers, servants, hands, not citizens, not thinkers, not equals. And then the state made one more demand. It said certain subjects in black schools had to be taught in Afrikaans. Mathematics, social studies. Subjects already difficult enough in overcrowded classrooms, with underpaid teachers, too few books, and buildings that seemed to carry neglect in the walls. Now the language of instruction itself became another barrier. A child who wanted to understand the world first had to pass through the language of his humiliation. For many students, this was not simply inconvenient. It was an insult. For many teachers, it was impossible. Some were not fluent enough in Afrikaans to teach complex subjects properly. Some understood what the policy really meant. It was not education. It was control. Months before the march, the pressure had already begun to show. In February 1976, signs of resistance appeared in Soweto schools. By April and May, strikes had spread. Students were no longer only whispering in corridors. They were organizing. At Naledi High, at Morris Isaacson, at schools across the township. A generation that apartheid had tried to silence was learning how to speak together. And behind that confidence stood something the government had underestimated. Black consciousness. The idea that black children did not need permission to know their own worth. The idea that inferiority was not natural. It had been taught. And if it had been taught, it could be rejected. On June 13, 1976, student representatives met. They planned a march. Not a riot. Not an attack. A march. The destination was Orlando Stadium. The message was clear. They would not accept Afrikaans as a forced medium of instruction. They would walk. They would gather. They would show discipline. And they would make the state look at them. But the state had its own language. Police files. Roadblocks. Bans. Batons. Bullets. By the morning of June 16th, thousands of students had joined the march. Some knew the plan. Some arrived at school and only then learned what was happening. A child hears that others are walking for the right to be taught with dignity. He follows. Another sees the placards. She joins. A crowd does not always begin as a crowd. Sometimes it begins as one decision repeated by thousands of young bodies. They walked through Soweto in school uniform. The uniforms mattered. They were not disguises. They were evidence. Evidence that the people in the street were pupils. Evidence that the protest had begun inside classrooms before it entered history. The students sang. They chanted. They carried signs. Down with Afrikaans. Education is our right. Equal education. The words were simple because the wound was simple. A child wanted to learn. A government wanted to decide how small that child's future should be. As the march moved, police appeared. The route was blocked. The atmosphere changed. Not all at once. That is important. Danger rarely announces itself in one clean moment. First there is uncertainty. A line of police. A crowd slowing. A student leader trying to keep order. A hand raised. A command. A refusal. Then the machinery of the state begins to reveal what it was built for. Near Orlando West, close to what would later become part of the memorial landscape of the uprising, the confrontation sharpened. Police used tear gas. Students scattered, coughed, regrouped. Some accounts speak of a pistol shot, then live ammunition, then children falling. And once the first bodies fell, the protest was no longer only about language. It was about the state's answer to a child's demand. By midday, the story was already moving faster than the authorities could control. Schools closed. Word spread through Soweto. A child had been shot.
No.
More than one. Nobody knew the full number. Nobody trusted the first number. In a township under apartheid, information did not travel cleanly. It moved through fear, through rumor, through mothers running, through classmates looking for names, through streets that suddenly felt too narrow for grief. The government would later give figures. Others would dispute them. On the night of June 16th, official numbers placed the death toll at 23. But other reports suggested far more. Some estimates spoke of at least 200. Later, for the broader period of unrest up to February 1977, the Silly Commission recorded 575 deaths, thousands injured, and thousands arrested. Even those numbers were disputed, because counting the dead is never only administration. It is power. Who counts?
Who is counted?
Who disappears between the police report, the clinic, the mortuary, and the family waiting at home? That question has never fully left the uprising. One image became the world's evidence. Hector Pieterson, carried in the arms of Mbuyisa Makubo. His sister Antoinette Sithole running beside them. A photograph taken in the chaos became an accusation no government statement could soften. But even that image carries a warning. A photograph can reveal. It can also narrow memory. Hector became the symbol. But he was not the only child. Hastings Ndlovu is often remembered among the first, possibly the first, to be shot that day. Others died without becoming images. Others were injured without becoming names the world learned. The archive remembers unevenly, and sometimes the most famous evidence casts shadows over the rest. By the afternoon of June 16th, Soweto was burning. Not because children had begun the day seeking fire, but because a line had been crossed. State buildings were attacked. Vehicles linked to township administration were burned. Beer halls and bottle stores, symbols of state control and humiliation, became targets. The anger had found objects. The township was no longer asking to be heard. It was answering. By night, armored vehicles entered Soweto. The police presence hardened. The language of education had become the language of war. The next day, June 17th, the state escalated. More police. Automatic weapons. Helicopters. The army on standby. Soweto was no longer treated as a place of schools and homes. It was treated as hostile territory. Workers stayed away. The unrest spread. Tembisa. Kagiso. Alexandra. The East Strand. The West Strand. Other townships began to move. A protest that had started with schoolchildren had become a national crisis. And that is where the story becomes larger than one morning. The uprising did not appear from nowhere. It had been prepared by decades of law. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 had placed black education under direct state control. Its purpose was not hidden. Apartheid did not need educated black citizens who could compete equally. It needed a labor force that knew its place. Schooling became one of the quietest weapons in the system. The classroom was not neutral. The textbook was not neutral. The timetable was not neutral. Even the language of a lesson could become a border. By 1976, Soweto's schools were overcrowded and underfunded. For years, too few high schools had been built. Enrollment had grown. Facilities had not. Teachers struggled. Children sat inside a system that had been designed to limit them and then blamed them for not rising. The state called it education. The students recognized it as preparation for obedience. That is why June 16th could not be contained. Because once a child understands that the school itself has become part of the prison, the protest does not end at the classroom door. The state responded with law, meeting bans, detentions, banning orders, restrictions, security legislation, publications controlled, people arrested. By June 19th, the government had already announced bans connected to the revolt and moved against gatherings. Hundreds would be detained in the months that followed. The message was clear. The state had heard the students, and it answered by trying to make organization itself illegal. But internationally, the story had already escaped. The United Nations Security Council condemned the shootings. Foreign newspapers carried the images. The photograph of Hector Pieterson moved across the world like a document no censor could retrieve. South Africa's apartheid government had long tried to present itself as orderly, stable, civilized. On June 16th, schoolchildren broke that performance. They exposed the violence underneath the administration. The uprising also changed the struggle inside South Africa. After the Rivonia arrests and the banning of liberation movements, apartheid had tried to create the feeling that resistance had been contained. 1976 ended that illusion. The youth entered the center of politics. Some went into exile. Some joined liberation movements. Some entered armed struggle. Some stayed and endured detention, interrogation, police harassment, and trauma that would live in the body long after the slogans faded. The class of 1976 did not simply witness history. They became one of its engines. But there is a danger in telling the story too cleanly. If we say the children marched, the police fired, the world reacted, and history changed, we make the past easier than it was. The truth is more uncomfortable. The uprising was not one moment. It was a rupture. A rupture in education, in policing, in family life, in international opinion, in the psychology of a generation. A parent sent a child to school and did not know the child was walking into history. A teacher looked at a classroom and knew the lesson had already moved outside. A student carried a placard and may not have understood that by night, the country would no longer be the same. And the state counted, managed,
Denied.
restricted,
Contained. Filed.
That is what systems do when blood enters the record. They try to turn it into paperwork. But paper remembers. It remembers the Bantu Education Act. It remembers the language directive. It remembers the school strikes before June. It remembers the march planned for Orlando Stadium. It remembers the roadblock, the tear gas, the gunfire, the dead whose number still refuses to settle. It remembers the children who were photographed and the children who were not. Today, June 16th, is Youth Day in South Africa. There are speeches, ceremonies, wreaths, television packages, school assemblies. A nation pauses to remember the courage of young people. But remembrance can become comfortable if it is not careful. The question is not only what happened in Soweto. The question is what the state believed a black child's mind was worth. The question is how a language policy became a death sentence. The question is why the number of the dead still comes with dispute. The question is what it means when a government fears children carrying books. Because the children of Soweto were not asking for luxury. They were asking to be taught with dignity. They were asking not to be shaped for servitude. They were asking not to have their future translated into obedience. And for that, police waited in the road. There is a moment in every uprising before history gives it a name. Before the museum. Before the memorial. Before the anniversary. Before the photograph becomes iconic. In that moment, it is still only a child walking. A placard held in both hands. A school shoe scraping dust. A voice inside a crowd. A morning that still believes it might end safely. On June 16, 1976, that belief did not survive the day. By night, the state had its figures. Families had empty rooms. The world had an image. And South Africa had a wound that would not close. The uprising began with a language. But it was never only about words. It was about who had the power to name a child's future, and who had the courage to refuse. The file remains open, not because we do not know what happened, but because every generation must ask why it was allowed to happen. And somewhere between the classroom and the roadblock, between the chalkboard and the gunfire, Between the official number and the names still carried in private grief, one sentence remains unfinished. They were children. They were marching to be taught. And the lesson the state gave them was,